She came home a day early and saw her boyfriend at the altar with her best friend. Samantha told me later that the first thing she noticed was not Albert. It was the flowers. There were too many of them outside the little Cleveland church, and she remembered thinking someone must be having a wedding. Then she saw a car she recognized. Then another. By the time she walked through the doors, she was still trying to convince herself there had to be some other explanation. Then she heard Albert's voice. "I do." She looked toward the altar. Albert was standing there, and beside him was Camille, the woman who had known Samantha for more than 10 years. Samantha didn't scream. She didn't run toward them. She just stood there, holding her overnight bag, trying to understand why everyone in that room looked so certain that Albert belonged there. Then she picked up a wedding program from an empty chair. The date printed on it was Sunday. Samantha had come home on Saturday, a day early, and that was when she realized the strangest part wasn't that Albert was getting married. It was that the wedding had already started. Welcome to Daily Comfort Stories, my wonderful family. I'm truly grateful to have you here. If you're new, comment your time and where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe as we continue sharing meaningful stories together. Before the church, before the wedding program with the wrong date, Samantha had spent most of her life believing that being dependable was one of the safest ways to love people. If someone needed her, she came. That was simply how she had been raised. Samantha was 32 and had lived in Cleveland, Ohio for almost her entire life. She knew the city in the ordinary way people know the places that have shaped them. She knew which streets flooded after heavy rain, which grocery store had the shortest lines on Sunday mornings, and how quickly a Cleveland winter could turn a 10-minute drive into something that required patience. Her life wasn't glamorous. She worked a steady office job, paid her bills, helped her family when she could, and tried to keep enough money in her savings account that an unexpected expense wouldn't immediately become a crisis. Her mother, Denise, had taught her that kind of discipline. Denise had raised Samantha and her younger son, Marcus, without much money to spare. She worked hard, kept the house running, and somehow managed to make her children feel secure, even during the years when she was probably worried about money herself. Samantha remembered one particular habit her mother had. Whenever Denise was stressed, she cleaned. Not because the house was necessarily dirty. Sometimes she'd be standing at the kitchen counter wiping an already clean surface while thinking about a bill or an argument or something she didn't want her children worrying about. Samantha had inherited the habit in a different form. She fixed things. When Marcus was younger and forgot an important school deadline, Samantha was the one reminding him. When Denise received a confusing letter in the mail, Samantha would sit at the kitchen table with her and read through it. When a family member needed a ride, Samantha figured out how to make it work. She rarely said no, and when she did, she usually spent the next hour feeling guilty about it. Marcus once teased her about that. "You know people can survive without you, right?" Samantha had laughed. "That's what people say right before they need something." Marcus shook his head. "See? That's exactly what I'm talking about." She didn't think much of it at the time. To Samantha, helping people wasn't a burden. It was how she showed love. She wasn't especially good at grand romantic gestures. She wasn't the kind of person who wrote long letters or planned elaborate surprises. She remembered birthdays. She returned phone calls. She showed up at hospitals. She brought groceries when someone was sick. If somebody told her they needed her at 7, she tried to be there at 6:45. Her grandmother had been the same way. That was one reason the small two-family house her grandmother left behind meant so much to Samantha. The house wasn't beautiful. It needed work. The paint was old in places, one of the upstairs windows stuck whenever the weather changed, and the kitchen had cabinets that seemed determined to remain from another decade. But Samantha remembered visiting her grandmother there as a child. She remembered the smell of Sunday cooking. She remembered sitting on the back steps during summer evenings. She remembered being told that a house didn't have to be perfect to be worth keeping. After her grandmother died, the property eventually came to Samantha. It was an asset, but to her it was more than that. It was family, something that had survived, something she was supposed to take care of. Looking back, Samantha would realize that she had carried that same responsibility into almost every part of her life, including love. When Albert came into her life, he noticed that about her almost immediately. He was 38, raised in a suburb outside Cleveland, and had a quieter personality than Samantha. He wasn't flashy. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He liked routines, planned ahead, and actually read instruction manuals before assembling furniture. Samantha found that strangely comforting. One of the first things Albert said about her that made her smile was that she was the kind of person who actually does what she says. She remembered that sentence. At the time, she heard it as admiration. She had no reason to believe that one day she would wonder whether being that person had cost her more than she realized. Samantha didn't fall in love with Albert because he swept her off her feet. That wasn't how it happened. There was no dramatic first date, no expensive restaurant, no moment where Samantha went home and immediately called Denise to announce that she had met the man she was going to marry. Albert simply kept showing up. That was what Samantha noticed. Their first few months together were made up of ordinary evenings and small routines. Sometimes they went out for dinner, but just as often they stayed home and tried to make something from whatever was already in the refrigerator. Albert was surprisingly serious about grocery shopping. He would stand in the produce section comparing prices while Samantha tossed things into the cart. "We don't need 3 kinds of tomatoes," he said one Saturday. "We might." "For what?" "I don't know yet." Albert looked at the cart. "You're planning meals after you buy the ingredients?" "That's how creativity works." He laughed and pushed the cart forward. "You're expensive. You're boring. I prefer financially responsible. You prefer boring." They smiled at each other, and Samantha liked how easy it felt. Albert didn't need to dominate every conversation. He didn't seem threatened by her confidence, and he didn't make her feel like she had to become smaller to make him comfortable. When they cooked together, he chopped vegetables while Samantha handled the stove. Sometimes he would taste something and make a face. "You didn't put enough seasoning in this. You haven't even swallowed it. I know what I'm tasting. You know nothing." He would reach for the seasoning anyway. Those little arguments became part of their rhythm. They also argued about money. Not because either of them was irresponsible, but because they viewed money differently. Samantha liked having a cushion. Albert preferred planning around specific goals. One evening they sat at Samantha's kitchen table with a notebook between them. "We're spending too much on takeout," Albert said. "We're spending too much because you keep ordering from that place you like. You're the one who suggested it. You said you were hungry. You said you didn't want to cook." Samantha leaned back. "So this is my fault?" Albert smiled. "No, I'm just saying we could save more." She looked at the numbers. He wasn't wrong. That was one of the things she appreciated about him. Albert wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine simply to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. He wanted a plan, and Samantha liked plans. Eventually their conversations became more serious. Marriage came up naturally. At first it was hypothetical. "Would you ever want to live outside Cleveland?" Albert asked one evening. Samantha looked at him. "Why?" "I'm asking. That's not an answer." He shrugged. "I don't know. Somewhere quieter." She smiled. "Your mother would miss you. My mother would survive. And Denise would worry if I moved too far." Albert studied her. "You always think about everybody else." "That's not true." "It is." She laughed and changed the subject. But Albert remembered. He had already begun noticing something Samantha herself didn't fully recognize. Whenever she imagined the future, other people's needs were already inside the picture. His parents, her mother, Marcus, the property, work, bills, everybody had a place. Sometimes Samantha wasn't sure where she had put herself. Still, their relationship continued to grow. Albert introduced her to his parents, who welcomed her without making a production of it. His mother asked Samantha questions about her work. His father wanted to know what she thought of the neighborhood. On the drive home, Albert glanced over at her. "They like you. I could tell. My mother doesn't like everybody. Should I be worried?" "No," he smiled. "I think she already sees you as family." That sentence stayed with Samantha. A few months later they started looking at houses. Not seriously at first. They went to open houses on weekends mostly because Samantha enjoyed imagining what a future home might look like. Albert paid attention to mortgage rates. Samantha paid attention to kitchens. "You're looking at the countertops," Albert said. "I'm looking at potential. You're looking at countertops. Same thing." One afternoon they toured a modest house that needed some work. It had a small backyard and an unfinished basement. Albert stood in the living room and looked around. "I could see us here." Samantha looked at him. "Us?" He turned toward her. "Who else?" She smiled. It was one of those moments that seemed too ordinary to remember. Years later, she would remember every detail: the afternoon light, the dusty windows, the way Albert said us, as though their future were already settled. They also talked about the two-family house her grandmother had left her. Albert never initially treated it as something that belonged to him. He asked questions. "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know yet." "Keep it?" "Probably. What if you renovated it?" Samantha shrugged. "Maybe rent one side." Albert nodded. "That could help long-term." They talked about possibilities without deciding anything. At that stage, Samantha trusted the conversations because they felt mutual. They were two people imagining a life together. She didn't realize that years later, those same conversations would become evidence of how differently two people could remember the same future. For a while, though, there was no reason to worry. Albert was steady. Samantha was dependable. They loved each other. And when Samantha looked at him across the kitchen one ordinary night, watching him struggle to open a stubborn jar, she felt something she hadn't experienced often in her life: peace. She didn't know that peace was about to be tested, and she certainly didn't know that the person she trusted to build a future with her would eventually start building one without her. Denise's illness didn't begin with one frightening phone call. It began with small things Samantha almost dismissed. Her mother complained about being unusually tired. Then came another appointment, then another. There were tests, medication changes, follow-up visits, and conversations with doctors that seemed to leave Denise with more questions than answers. At first, Samantha tried to keep everything in perspective. "It's probably nothing," Denise told her one evening. Samantha looked at her across the kitchen table. "Then why are you going back next week?" Denise sighed. "Because that's what doctors do. They want to see you again." Samantha didn't argue, but she started rearranging her life. She took time off when she could. She drove Denise to appointments. She called insurance companies when bills didn't make sense. She kept notes in her phone because there were too many details to remember. Albert helped at first. He brought groceries to Denise's house. He drove Samantha to the airport when she needed to travel. Once, when Samantha was exhausted after spending nearly an entire day dealing with insurance, Albert showed up at her door with dinner. "You didn't have to do that," she told him. "I know." He handed her the bag. "That's why I did it." She smiled and hugged him. For a while, Albert seemed to understand. But Denise's condition didn't improve quickly. Samantha began spending longer periods away from Cleveland, and every time she left, she promised Albert she wouldn't be gone as long as the previous trip. Then something changed with her mother's health. A routine appointment became another test. The test led to another specialist. The specialist wanted more information. Suddenly, Samantha's calendar was filled with medical appointments, phone calls, travel arrangements, and conversations she wasn't emotionally prepared to have. Her relationship with Albert didn't disappear. It simply moved down the list. That distinction mattered. Samantha still loved him. She still thought about him. But love had become something she assumed could wait. Albert began feeling the difference. One weekend, they had planned to spend 2 days together. Samantha was supposed to come home Friday evening. Instead, Denise had a difficult day. Samantha called Albert from a hospital parking lot. "I can't come tonight." There was silence on the other end. "I understand," Albert said. "You don't sound like you understand." "I said I understand." Samantha closed her eyes. "Albert, I don't have the energy to argue. I'm not arguing." "Okay." Another silence. Then he said, "You know, sometimes I feel like I'm only allowed to be disappointed if nobody else needs you." Samantha didn't know what to say. She was tired. She had barely eaten. She was sitting in her car with her mother's medical paperwork on the passenger seat. "Albert, my mom is sick." "I know." "Then what are we doing?" "I don't know." That answer frightened her more than anger would have. She drove home 2 days later. Albert was polite, too polite. He asked how Denise was doing. He carried Samantha's bags inside. He made coffee. But something between them felt different. Samantha noticed it. She just didn't know what to do with it. Then came the dinner with Albert's parents. Samantha had promised she would attend. She forgot. Not intentionally. She simply lost track of the date. When Albert reminded her, she was already several hours away. "I am so sorry," she said over the phone. "My parents are already here." "I know. You told me you were coming." "I know." He exhaled. "I'll handle it." Samantha sat silently. There were times when an apology was enough. This wasn't one of them. "I'll make it up to you," she said. Albert didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "That's what you always say." The words stayed with her, not because they were cruel, because there was truth inside them. She had started promising future attention to compensate for present absence. She would make time later, she would call later, she would be more present later. But later kept moving. One night, after Samantha had spent most of the day dealing with an insurance problem, Albert called. His voice sounded tired. "I don't know where I fit anymore." Samantha sat on the edge of the bed. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't feel like I'm part of your life." "You know that's not true." "Do I?" She rubbed her forehead. "Albert, I'm trying to get my mother through this. I know." "Then what do you want from me?" "I want you to see me. I do see you." "No, Samantha. You see what needs fixing. You see the next appointment, the next bill, the next problem. You see everybody." He paused. "Just don't know when you see me." Her exhaustion turned into defensiveness. "You knew what you were getting into. I didn't know I'd disappear." She stared at the wall. For a moment neither spoke. Samantha wanted him to understand that she wasn't choosing her mother over him. She wanted him to understand that she was scared. But instead of saying that, she said the sentence she would later regret. "My mom needs me more than you do right now." Albert went quiet. Samantha immediately knew it sounded worse than she intended, but she was too tired to correct it. "Good night, Albert." "Good night." The call ended. Samantha placed her phone beside her and sat there in the dark. She told herself they would talk tomorrow. They would explain what they meant. They would fix it. Because that was what Samantha believed people who loved each other did. They fixed things. What she didn't know was that Albert had just reached the point where he was no longer certain he wanted to keep waiting for her to fix theirs. And neither of them understood that this quiet, painful conversation would later become one of the explanations Albert used to justify what he did next. After that phone call, Samantha expected Albert to call the next morning. He didn't. She told herself he was giving her space. By lunchtime, she had convinced herself he was probably busy. By evening, she was irritated that he hadn't checked on her. Then she remembered the way their conversation had ended, and felt guilty for being irritated. So she called him. Albert answered on the fourth ring. "Hey." His voice sounded normal, too normal. "Are you okay?" Samantha asked. "Yeah. You didn't call today. I figured you were busy." "I was." "I know." Samantha waited for him to say something else. He didn't. "You're quiet. I'm tired." She leaned against the kitchen counter. "Okay." Another pause. "Do you want to talk about yesterday?" she asked. Albert looked across his apartment at the stack of unopened mail on the counter. Part of him wanted to say everything. He wanted to tell her that he felt lonely, that he missed her, that he was beginning to resent every hospital, every appointment, every phone call that seemed to matter more than anything he said. Instead, he said, "There's nothing to talk about." That was the first lie of its kind. Not a lie about another person, not yet. A lie about himself, because there was plenty to talk about. He simply stopped believing Samantha would have room to hear it. Over the next few weeks, Albert became quieter. When Samantha canceled a weekend visit because Denise had another appointment, he said, "Okay." When she forgot to call one evening, he didn't mention it. When she told him she might not make it home for a dinner they had planned, he replied, "Don't worry about it." Samantha thought he was becoming more understanding. She didn't realize he was keeping score. He remembered everything: the dinner she missed, the weekend she canceled, the birthday celebration she left early, the night she fell asleep while they were talking. He didn't write any of it down. He didn't need to. It stayed in his head. And each disappointment became evidence supporting a conclusion he was slowly building. Samantha had chosen a life that didn't have room for him. The problem was that Albert never told her how serious that conclusion had become. He still loved her. That was what made everything complicated. He kept photographs of them on his phone. He still wore the watch Samantha had given him. When someone at work asked about his relationship, he still said, "My girlfriend." But resentment had begun sitting beside love. Sometimes Samantha would call and talk about Denise for 20 minutes. Albert would listen. He would ask questions. He would tell her he hoped her mother felt better. Then he would hang up and stare at his phone, angry that she hadn't asked how his day had been. He knew that wasn't entirely fair. He could have told her. Instead, he expected her to notice. One evening, Samantha called while Albert was preparing dinner. "I'm sorry I haven't been around much," she said. Albert paused. "You don't have to apologize." "I know. I just feel like I've been neglecting you." He looked down at the food on the stove. "You have a lot going on." There was a softness in Samantha's voice. "Thank you for understanding." Albert closed his eyes. He wanted to say, "I'm not okay with this." He wanted to say, "I need you too." Instead, he said, "Of course." After they hung up, he sat at the table alone. The apartment was quiet. For the first time, he wondered what would happen if Samantha never changed. The thought frightened him. Then another thought followed. What if I don't have to wait? He didn't act on it, not then. But once the possibility entered his mind, he couldn't completely remove it. And when Albert eventually needed someone to talk to, there was one person he knew would understand Samantha better than almost anyone. Camille. He had known her for years. She was Samantha's best friend. He had always considered her safe. At least, that was what he believed when he picked up his phone and called her. Camille answered Albert's call because she recognized his number. It wasn't unusual for him to contact her. Over the years, Samantha had made the three of them familiar with one another. Camille had been at birthdays, dinners, holiday gatherings, and the occasional weekend outing. Albert knew her well enough to call when he needed to ask something about Samantha. That evening, though, he didn't ask about Samantha. He just said, "Can I ask you something?" Camille was sitting on her couch with her shoes kicked off. "Sure." "Has Samantha always been like this?" Camille frowned. "Like what? Like shutting people out when things get difficult?" There was a pause. Camille could have defended her friend immediately. Instead, she asked, "What happened?" Albert told her about the canceled plans, the missed dinner, the phone calls that ended quickly. He told her he understood Denise was sick, but he felt as though his own feelings had become inconvenient. Camille listened. When he finished, she said, "She's overwhelmed. I know. She loves you. I know that too. Then what are you asking me?" Albert leaned back in his chair. "I don't know." Camille was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know Samantha, when she gets scared she goes into problem-solving mode." Albert almost smiled. "That sounds like her. She doesn't always realize she's pushing people away." "I know." Camille's voice softened. "You're not wrong for feeling hurt." That sentence stayed with Albert. He hadn't heard it from Samantha. He hadn't heard it from anyone. "I don't want to compete with her mother," he said. "You shouldn't. Just want to feel like I matter." "You do." Albert rubbed his forehead. "Then why doesn't it feel that way?" Camille didn't have an answer, but she understood the feeling. She had known Samantha long enough to know that Samantha could become consumed by whatever crisis was directly in front of her. There had been times when Camille herself had felt forgotten. The difference was that Camille had always forgiven her, or at least she told herself she had. After that call, Albert didn't contact Camille again for several days. Then one evening, she called him. "How's Samantha?" Albert was surprised. "She's okay. How are you?" He hesitated. "I'm fine." Camille laughed quietly. "You don't sound fine." That conversation lasted nearly an hour. Then another happened a few days later. Then another. At first, they talked almost exclusively about Samantha. Camille explained things Albert didn't understand. She reminded him that Samantha hated asking for help. She told him that Denise's illness had frightened her more than she admitted. She said Samantha probably felt guilty every time she wasn't with her mother. Albert listened. Camille felt useful. That was the first shift. She wasn't simply helping Samantha's boyfriend understand her anymore. She was becoming the person Albert turned to when he felt hurt. And there was something about being needed that Camille enjoyed. She didn't recognize it as dangerous. Not yet. One evening, Albert said something that made her uncomfortable. "I think I know what Samantha would say if I told her all this." "What?" "She'd say she can't deal with another problem." Camille looked toward the window. "She might." Albert laughed bitterly. "See?" Camille didn't laugh. "She doesn't mean to make you feel that way. I know. But you can't keep disappearing inside the relationship either." Albert was quiet. Camille realized she had moved beyond explaining Samantha. She was advising Albert. That distinction mattered. She should have stopped. Instead, she continued. You've got to be honest with her. I've tried. Try harder. I don't know how. Camille sighed. Then maybe you're not waiting for Samantha anymore. Maybe you're waiting for her to give you permission to leave. The words came out more naturally than she expected. The moment she said them, Albert became silent. Camille could almost hear the thought forming in his mind. Maybe you're right, he said. She immediately felt a small knot in her stomach. I didn't say you should leave. I know, just mean. I understand. But he didn't understand the way she intended. He heard permission. Not permission from Samantha. Permission from someone who knew Samantha intimately. After that night, Albert started talking to Camille differently. He told her things he wasn't telling Samantha. He admitted he was afraid their relationship was dying. He told her he sometimes felt guilty for wanting more. He told her he missed being someone's priority. Camille listened, and slowly something changed inside her. She began comparing herself to Samantha. Samantha had Albert. Samantha had family. Samantha had the property. Samantha had the stable life Camille had always imagined she would have by 30. And now Albert was sitting on the other side of a phone, telling Camille that the woman who seemed to have everything was failing to appreciate him. It was a dangerous combination. Albert felt unseen. Camille felt overlooked. Together, they began filling gaps in each other's lives. Neither called it an affair. They didn't have to. The boundary was already moving, and neither of them seemed willing to move it back. The first secret between Albert and Camille wasn't the kiss. It was a phone call Samantha didn't know about. It happened on a Tuesday evening when Samantha was staying with Denise. Albert had called Camille after work, and what began as a conversation about Samantha lasted nearly 2 hours. They talked about things that had nothing to do with Samantha. Camille told Albert about a difficult day at work. Albert told her about an argument he'd had with his father. They laughed. It felt easy. That was the problem. Neither of them had to explain why they were calling. Neither had to apologize for needing attention. When the conversation ended, Camille looked at the time and realized how late it had become. She immediately felt guilty. We shouldn't be doing this, she said. Albert was quiet. Doing what? Talking like this. You mean because of Samantha? Yes. Albert sighed. I haven't done anything. Camille knew that wasn't completely true. Neither did he, but neither wanted to say it. The next morning, Samantha called Camille. How's Albert? Making coffee. He's fine. Have you talked to him lately? The question caught Camille off guard. A little. How's he doing? Camille stared at the coffee dripping into the pot. He misses you. Samantha lowered her voice. I miss him too. Camille felt something uncomfortable move through her. She knew Samantha was trying. She knew Samantha loved Albert. And yet part of her wanted to believe that Samantha had already lost him. It would make everything easier. So she said, You should probably talk to him. I will. After they hung up, Camille stood in the kitchen for several minutes. She knew she had lied by omission. She hadn't told Samantha that she and Albert had been talking almost every night. She hadn't told her that Albert had begun confiding in her. She hadn't told her that she had started looking forward to his calls. The secret grew because nobody stopped it. Albert began deleting messages. Camille started putting her phone face down whenever Samantha was nearby. They developed little jokes that Samantha didn't understand. One afternoon, Samantha noticed Camille smiling at her phone. What? Camille looked up. Nothing. Who are you texting? Work. Samantha nodded. She didn't question it. That trust made Camille feel worse. It should have stopped her. Instead, she became more careful. Albert and Camille eventually met for coffee. It was supposed to be a short conversation. They told themselves they needed to talk face to face because the situation was getting confusing. Camille arrived first. Albert sat across from her. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Camille said, This isn't okay. Albert looked down. I know. You're with Samantha. I know. And I'm her best friend. I know. The repetition made them both uncomfortable. Camille looked toward the window. Then why are we here? Albert didn't answer, because they both knew they weren't there to end it. They were there because neither wanted to walk away. When they left the coffee shop, Albert walked Camille to her car. She turned toward him. Albert. He looked at her. For a second, neither moved. Then he kissed her. It lasted only a few seconds. But when they pulled apart, Camille immediately stepped back. "Oh my God!" Albert looked shaken too. "We shouldn't have done that." "No, we can't." "I know." They stood beside the cars in silence. This was the moment when everything could still have changed. Albert could have gone home and told Samantha the truth. Camille could have called her best friend and admitted what had happened. They could have ended the relationship before it became something larger. Instead, Albert said, "I don't know what to do." Camille looked at him, and instead of saying go home, she said, "Neither do I." That was their choice, not the kiss, the decision to continue after it. They became more secretive. Albert told Samantha he had worked late when he had actually met Camille. Camille told Samantha she had been home when she had spent the evening talking to Albert. Every lie made the next one easier, and Samantha remained unaware. She was still focused on Denise. She was still trying to keep her job from falling apart. She was still calling Albert whenever she had a quiet moment. She still believed their relationship was wounded but repairable. One night, Samantha called Camille while Camille was sitting beside Albert. Camille looked at the phone. Samantha's name was glowing across the screen. Albert saw it too. Neither spoke. Finally, Camille answered. "Hey, girl." Samantha's voice sounded tired. "Are you busy?" Camille glanced at Albert. "No, I'm home." Albert looked away. Samantha sighed. "Just needed someone to talk to." Camille swallowed. "Of course." Samantha began telling her about Denise. Camille listened while Albert sat only a few feet away, and for the first time, Camille understood the full weight of what she was doing. Samantha wasn't calling a stranger. She wasn't calling someone who had chosen Albert over her. She was calling her best friend, the woman she trusted most. Camille closed her eyes. "I've got you," she whispered. Albert looked at her. The irony was almost unbearable, because Samantha believed she was talking to the person who would protect her. Instead, Camille was sitting beside the man who was helping destroy the relationship Samantha was still trying to save. When the call ended, Camille placed her phone on the table. Neither of them spoke. They had crossed another line, and this time, there was no way to pretend it was accidental. After the night Camille answered Samantha's call while sitting beside him, Albert knew there was no longer any honest way to describe what he and Camille were doing. But honesty was becoming less comfortable to him than explanation. So he started explaining. The first time he told Camille that his relationship with Samantha was basically over, he said it quietly. They were sitting in Albert's apartment, and Camille was looking down at her hands. "You need to figure out what you're doing," she said. Albert stared at the floor. "What do you mean?" "With Samantha." He didn't answer. Camille looked at him. "You can't keep saying you're unhappy and then go back to her like nothing happened." Albert rubbed his jaw. "She doesn't make time for me. I know. She hasn't for months. I know. She chose everything else." Camille didn't immediately respond. Albert continued. "I understand her mother is sick. I understand that. But where am I supposed to fit?" Camille looked uncomfortable. "Have you actually told Samantha that?" Albert's silence answered her. "You haven't," Camille said. "I've tried. You told her you were lonely." "She knew what I meant." "No," Camille said. "She probably didn't." Albert looked at her. For a moment, he seemed angry. Then his expression softened. "She emotionally left me a long time ago." Camille knew that wasn't entirely fair. She had seen Samantha during the worst months with Denise. She knew how frightened her friend was. She knew Samantha wasn't deliberately trying to hurt Albert. But Camille also knew Albert was lonely. That made it easier to listen to his version. "Maybe," Camille said carefully, "you've already made up your mind." Albert looked at her. "I don't know how to leave." There it was. The sentence that made him feel less responsible. He wasn't choosing betrayal, he told himself. He was trapped in a relationship that had already ended emotionally. That explanation allowed him to continue without thinking of himself as the person causing the damage. The problem was that Samantha didn't know their relationship was over. She still called Albert her boyfriend. She still apologized when she couldn't come home. She still talked about what they might do together when Denise became more stable. One afternoon she called Albert from her mother's house. "I was thinking," she said, Maybe when things calm down, we should take that weekend trip we talked about. Albert was silent. You remember? Yeah. I found a place that looks nice. He looked toward the window. You should book it. Samantha smiled. I want us to go together. Albert felt something twist inside him. He should have told her. He should have said, Samantha, I don't think we're together anymore. Instead, he said, We'll see. She didn't hear the distance in his voice, or perhaps she heard it and assumed it was exhaustion. That was the cruelest part. Samantha was still trying, not perfectly, not consistently, but sincerely. She had begun making small plans again. She wanted to come home more often. She wanted to spend a weekend with Albert. She wanted to talk about the house they had once looked at. She even started looking at her grandmother's property differently. Maybe they could renovate it. Maybe the rental income could help them save. Maybe they could eventually buy a home together. She didn't know that Albert had already begun imagining those same possibilities with someone else. One evening, Camille asked him directly, Does Samantha know you're thinking about leaving? Albert shook his head. Not exactly. Then she doesn't know. Albert frowned. Camille, you know what our relationship has been like. I know what you've told me. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means I wasn't there for every conversation. Albert didn't like the distinction. He wanted Camille to accept his version completely, so he repeated the things he had been telling himself for months. Samantha didn't make time for him. She had emotionally abandoned him. He had waited. He had tried. He deserved to be happy. And slowly those statements stopped sounding like excuses to him. They started sounding like facts. That was how Albert changed. Not through one dramatic decision, through repetition. Every time he told the story, he removed another piece of his own responsibility. By the end of the conversation, he was no longer saying, I'm betraying Samantha. He was saying, I'm finally moving on. Camille listened, and because she wanted to believe she wasn't helping destroy her best friend's relationship, she accepted the version that made the least painful sense. Neither of them said the obvious thing. If Albert truly believed their relationship was over, there was a simple way to prove it. He could tell Samantha, he could leave. He could begin a new relationship honestly. But that would require him to face the consequences of his choice. Instead, he kept Samantha in the old relationship while quietly building a new life. And that was when the future began taking shape without her. The conversation about Samantha's grandmother's house had always seemed harmless. When Samantha and Albert first discussed it, they had been standing in the kitchen looking at photographs of the property on Samantha's phone. It needs work, Albert had said. I know. How much? I have no idea. Albert smiled. You should find out. Samantha laughed. You make everything sound like a project. Because everything costs money. She had rolled her eyes, but she knew he was right. The property was a modest two-family house in Cleveland. It had been in Samantha's family for decades, and after her grandmother died, it eventually became Samantha's responsibility. One unit was occupied, while the other needed repairs. Samantha had always talked about keeping it. She liked the idea of preserving something her grandmother had left behind. Albert understood that. At least he used to. Months later, after his relationship with Camille had become more serious, Albert found himself looking at the property again. This time, Samantha wasn't sitting beside him. He started researching renovation costs online. How much would the roof cost? What would it take to update the kitchen? How much could the property potentially rent for after repairs? He opened spreadsheets. He compared estimates. He looked at listings for similar homes in nearby neighborhoods. At first, he told himself this was simply practical. He had always been interested in finances, and if Samantha eventually sold the house, he reasoned, they could use the money toward a new home. The word they had quietly changed meaning. It no longer meant Albert and Samantha. It meant Albert and Camille. He didn't tell Camille everything at first. One evening, she noticed him looking at numbers on his laptop. What are you working on? Nothing. She smiled. You've been saying that a lot lately. Albert turned the screen slightly. It's the property. Camille's expression changed. Samantha's? Yeah. What about it? I've been looking at what it might be worth after renovations. Camille sat down. Why? Albert shrugged. Because we talked about it before. We, Samantha and I. Camille was quiet. Albert quickly added, she was considering selling eventually. Was she? I think so. Camille accepted the answer. She wanted to. The truth was less convenient. Samantha had never told Camille she had decided to sell. She had talked about possibilities. She had mentioned repairs. She had talked about rental income. But nothing had been settled. Albert knew that. He also knew that Samantha trusted him with information about the property because she believed they were building a life together. That knowledge should have made him stop. Instead, he used it to plan. He contacted someone about renovation estimates. He asked questions about financing. He looked at potential rental income. None of it was dramatic. There was no secret meeting in a dark room, no forged documents, no grand scheme. It was something more ordinary and, in its own way, more revealing. Albert had begun behaving as though the future he imagined gave him rights in the present. One afternoon, Samantha called him unexpectedly. "Did you contact someone about the house?" Albert froze. "What? The property? Why?" "I got an email from someone asking about renovation work." Albert's mind raced. "Was just looking into some numbers." "You contacted somebody?" "Just for an estimate." Samantha was quiet. "You could have told me. I didn't think it was a big deal. It is to me." Albert felt defensive. "We've talked about renovating it. We talked about it together." "I know. Then why didn't you tell me?" He sighed. "Because I was trying to help." Samantha didn't respond immediately. Her voice softened. "Albert, I appreciate that, but it's still my property." The words landed differently than she intended. Albert heard distrust. He heard distance. He heard another reminder that there were parts of Samantha's life where he no longer felt included. "Fine," he said. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Get defensive. I said fine." She sighed. "I don't want to fight. Neither do I." They ended the call politely, but Albert was angry. Not because Samantha was wrong. She wasn't. The property belonged to her. He knew that. What bothered him was that he had begun thinking of it as part of the life he deserved, and now Samantha was reminding him that the life belonged to her. Later that night, Camille asked what happened. Albert told her Samantha was upset. "She thinks I'm trying to control the property." "Are you?" "No." Camille hesitated. "Then what are you trying to do?" Albert looked at the laptop. "I was trying to plan." For who? He didn't answer. Camille understood. And for the first time, she realized that Albert wasn't merely imagining a future with her. He was already using pieces of Samantha's life to build it. That should have frightened both of them. Instead, they kept going. Because once people convince themselves they deserve something, boundaries start looking less like boundaries and more like obstacles. The first time Camille saw a wedding venue with Albert, she almost turned around and left. It wasn't supposed to be a wedding appointment. At least, that was what they told themselves. They had gone to look at a small event space because Camille's cousin had mentioned it was affordable. They were only curious. They weren't making plans. But the woman showing them around asked a simple question. "So what date are you considering?" Camille looked at Albert. Albert looked at Camille. Neither answered. The woman smiled. "It's okay. You don't have to decide today." They thanked her and left. In the car, Camille stared through the windshield. "We shouldn't have gone in there." Albert kept his hands on the steering wheel. "I know. You're still with Samantha." Albert was quiet. Then he said the sentence he had repeated so many times that it barely sounded like a confession anymore. "Samantha and I were already finished." Camille looked at him. "She doesn't know that." Albert didn't answer. That silence bothered her, but she wanted to believe him, because if Samantha really had emotionally abandoned Albert, then Camille could tell herself that she hadn't stolen anything. She had simply become the person who was there when someone else stopped showing up. The story was easier that way, so Camille asked, "Do you love me?" Albert turned toward her. "Yes." The answer came quickly. That should have comforted her. Instead, she wondered whether he had once answered Samantha that quickly. She pushed the thought away. Over the next several weeks, wedding plans began quietly. They didn't announce anything. They didn't post photographs. They didn't tell Samantha. Albert said he wanted to avoid unnecessary drama. Camille agreed. But there was another reason. Neither of them wanted to explain how quickly everything had happened. They told themselves they were protecting their privacy. In reality, they were protecting the story they had created. Meanwhile, Samantha remained in Cleveland only intermittently. There were still appointments, still medication, still days when Samantha couldn't relax because she was waiting for the next phone call. But for the first time in months, there were signs of stability. One afternoon, Denise sat at the kitchen table while Samantha packed a small bag. "You're leaving Friday?" "Friday night." "When are you coming back?" "Sunday." Denise smiled. "Good." Samantha looked at her. "Good? You need to go home." "I am home. You know what I mean." Samantha smiled faintly. Denise reached across the table and touched her hand. "You've been taking care of everybody for so long that you've forgotten you have a life, too." Samantha looked down. "I haven't forgotten." Her mother raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Samantha laughed. "Okay, maybe a little." Denise squeezed her hand. "Go see Albert." Samantha smiled. "I miss him." "I know. I think we're finally going to get some normal time together." Denise nodded. "You deserve that." Samantha believed her. That Friday, Samantha prepared to leave. Her plan was simple. She would return to Cleveland on Sunday. She would spend the weekend with Albert. Maybe they would go somewhere for dinner. Maybe they would talk about the house again. Maybe she would finally tell him how scared she had been. She wanted to explain that her distance hadn't meant she loved him less. She just hadn't known how to be a daughter and a partner at the same time. Then on Friday morning, Denise surprised her. "Why don't you leave today?" Samantha looked up. "What?" "You keep saying you miss him." "I do. Then go." "But I told him Sunday." Denise smiled. "That's why it's called a surprise." Samantha laughed. "You're encouraging me to sneak up on my boyfriend?" "I'm encouraging my daughter to remember she has a boyfriend." Samantha shook her head. "You're impossible." "Maybe." Denise leaned back. "Go home early." Samantha hesitated. There was still part of her that worried about leaving her mother, but Denise looked stronger, and for once Samantha allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay for a few days. So she changed her ticket. Saturday afternoon. Cleveland. 1 day early. She didn't tell Albert. She wanted to surprise him. She imagined his face when he opened the door. Maybe he would complain that she should have warned him. Maybe he would hug her anyway. Maybe they would laugh about how badly she had timed everything. She didn't know that Albert had spent the previous weeks planning a different surprise. By Saturday afternoon, Samantha was driving through Cleveland with an overnight bag beside her. She was tired, but she felt lighter than she had in months. Then, on the way home, she noticed something unusual. A church parking lot was unusually full. She slowed down. There were flowers near the entrance. People were walking inside dressed more formally than usual. Then she recognized a car. She knew that car. Samantha pulled over. Her heart began beating faster. She sat there for several seconds trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the church. She didn't know why she was there. She only knew that something was wrong. Inside, she heard music. Then voices. Then a familiar voice. Albert. She stepped through the doorway, and there he was, standing at the altar, beside Camille. For a few seconds, Samantha couldn't understand what she was looking at. Then someone near the aisle shifted, revealing a wedding program. Samantha reached for it. She looked down. Sunday. Tomorrow's date. Her fingers tightened around the paper. She had come home a day early, and somehow, Albert's wedding was already happening. Samantha looked toward the altar again. Albert hadn't seen her yet. Neither had Camille. For the first time, Samantha understood that the future she thought she was coming home to had already been replaced, and she was standing inside the moment when the truth finally became impossible to ignore. Samantha had been awake since before 6 that morning, not because she had somewhere important to be, not because Denise needed her. For once, there was simply no emergency. She lay still for a few minutes in the unfamiliar quiet of her mother's house, staring at the ceiling and listening to the refrigerator hum from the kitchen. Then she smiled. She was going home. The thought still felt strange. For months, Cleveland had been a place she traveled away from and returned to only when circumstances allowed. Her life had become airports, doctors' offices, phone calls with insurance companies, medication schedules, and the constant mental calculation of whether Denise was doing well enough for Samantha to leave. That morning, though, her mother was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee. "You're sure you're okay?" Samantha asked. Denise looked over the rim of her mug. "I'm sure. You'll call me if you need anything? I've survived longer than you've been alive." Samantha smiled. "I know. Then stop looking at me like you're leaving a child alone." Samantha laughed. She zipped her bag and picked up the small paper gift bag sitting beside it. Denise noticed. "What is that?" "Nothing. Samantha," she sighed. "It's for Albert." Denise smiled knowingly. "What did you buy?" "A watch. A watch. He mentioned a few weeks ago that he wanted one." Denise shook her head. "You remembered that?" "Of course I remembered." "That girl," Denise said softly, almost to herself. "You remember everything everybody else says." Samantha didn't answer. She looked down at the bag. It wasn't an expensive watch. She had found it while shopping earlier in the week and thought Albert would like it. Simple, dark leather, nothing flashy. She had imagined giving it to him Sunday. Now she was going to surprise him a day early. The idea made her feel almost young again. On the drive back to Cleveland, Samantha stopped for coffee. She chose Albert's usual order without thinking. Medium coffee, 2 sugars, no cream. She smiled when she looked at the cup sitting in the passenger seat. For months, she had been carrying guilt about everything she hadn't been able to give him. That morning, she wasn't thinking about guilt. She was thinking about home. She imagined walking through the door. She imagined Albert's surprised expression. She imagined him complaining that she had ruined whatever he had planned for the weekend. She imagined herself laughing and saying, "I missed you." She even rehearsed what she wanted to tell him. That she was sorry. That she had been so focused on surviving her mother's illness that she had forgotten how lonely Albert might have been. That she wanted to make things different. She didn't know she was rehearsing an apology for a man who had already rehearsed an explanation for leaving her. By early afternoon, Samantha was back in Cleveland. The familiar streets brought back a strange sense of comfort. She passed the grocery store where she and Albert used to argue about whether they needed name-brand cereal. She passed the restaurant where they had celebrated their anniversary. She even passed the intersection where they had once spent nearly an hour arguing about whether they should buy a house or keep renting. Ordinary places, ordinary memories. She was smiling when she turned onto the road leading toward Albert's neighborhood. Then she noticed the church. At first, she barely paid attention. There were usually cars there on Saturdays, but this was different. The parking lot was crowded. There were flowers near the entrance. People in suits and dresses were walking toward the doors. Samantha slowed down. "What is going on?" She looked again. Then she recognized one of the cars. Her stomach tightened. She knew that car. She had seen it at family gatherings. She had sat in that passenger seat. She had even once borrowed the keys when its owner had been too tired to drive. Samantha pulled over. For several seconds, she simply sat there. The coffee beside her had gone cold. The little gift bag rested on the passenger seat. She looked at the church again. Something didn't make sense. Then she saw another familiar person walking inside. And another. Samantha's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She didn't know why those people were there, but she knew one thing. Whatever was happening inside that church had something to do with her life. She picked up the gift bag and walked toward the doors. The church doors were heavier than Samantha expected. She pushed one open slowly, almost as if making too much noise would somehow change what was happening inside. The first thing she noticed was the music, soft piano, then the flowers. White arrangements lined the aisle, carefully placed in tall glass vases. There were candles near the front. People filled most of the pews dressed in the kind of clothes Samantha associated with weddings, not ordinary Saturday gatherings. Her mind immediately searched for another explanation. Maybe someone else was getting married. Maybe Albert was helping with the ceremony. Maybe she had somehow misunderstood what she was seeing from the parking lot. Then she heard the minister. "And do you, Albert?" Samantha stopped. She knew that voice. She knew that name. She looked toward the altar. Albert was standing there in a dark suit. For 1 second, he looked exactly like the man she had spent years loving. Then Samantha saw the woman beside him, Camille, her best friend. Samantha didn't breathe. The little paper bag slipped slightly in her hand. She tightened her grip. Nobody had noticed her yet. The minister continued speaking. Samantha couldn't hear every word. She didn't need to. Albert was looking at Camille the way Samantha had once imagined he would look at her. Camille's eyes were wet. There were people smiling. Someone in the front row was holding a phone up to record. Samantha looked around the church. She recognized faces. People who knew Albert. People who knew Camille. People who knew Samantha. And suddenly the confusion became something else. This wasn't a rehearsal. It wasn't a private engagement. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They were getting married. Right now. Samantha's eyes moved to the nearest table. Programs were arranged neatly beside a basket of tissues. She picked one up. Her eyes went immediately to the date. Tomorrow, Sunday. She looked again, then again. Her mind refused to process it. The date on the program was tomorrow, but the ceremony was happening today. Samantha looked toward the altar. Albert still hadn't seen her, neither had Camille, and somehow that hurt almost as much as seeing them together. Because Samantha realized they had planned this without ever imagining she might appear. Or perhaps they had been certain she wouldn't. The minister asked Albert another question. Albert answered, "I do." The words reached Samantha clearly. She felt something inside her collapse, not dramatically. There was no scream, no falling to the floor. Just a quiet realization that the man she had expected to surprise at home was standing in a church promising his life to someone else. And the someone else was the woman who knew exactly how much Samantha loved him. Samantha could have walked down the aisle. She could have shouted his name. She could have told everyone that Albert was still her boyfriend. She could have exposed the affair. She could have demanded to know who had decided their relationship was over. But she looked at the faces around her and suddenly understood something. Everyone in that room had already been given a story. Albert had told them Samantha and he were finished. Camille had accepted that story. Maybe others had too. If Samantha created a scene, she would be fighting an entire room full of people who believed they understood what had happened. She didn't want to fight them. She wanted the truth, and she knew she wasn't going to find it standing in the middle of that aisle, so she stepped backward, quietly. One step, then another. The gift bag was still in her hand. The watch inside it suddenly felt ridiculous. She walked through the doors and into the afternoon sunlight. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called her name. Outside, she reached her car and sat behind the wheel. For several seconds, she didn't start the engine. She stared through the windshield. Then the tears came. She covered her mouth with one hand. She wasn't crying only because Albert was marrying Camille. She was crying because she had believed she was coming home to repair something. She had believed there was still a relationship waiting for her. And now she realized that the relationship had continued in her mind long after Albert had stopped treating it as real. She whispered the question before she could stop herself. Was Albert right? Samantha closed her eyes. Had she abandoned him? Had she stopped noticing how lonely he was? Yes. Had she expected him to understand indefinitely? Yes. Those truths hurt. But another truth stood beside them. She had been a flawed partner. She had not been an informed participant in her own breakup. If Albert wanted to leave, he could have left. If he wanted another woman, he could have told Samantha. If Camille believed Samantha had failed him, she could have spoken to her. Neither of them had chosen honesty. They had chosen secrecy. Samantha wiped her face. She looked at the gift bag again. Then she placed it on the floor of the passenger side. She didn't drive to the church again. She didn't call Albert. She didn't call Camille. She drove home. And for the first time since she had known either of them, Samantha decided that before she asked anyone else what had happened, she was going to find out what the facts said, because heartbreak could make a person doubt her own memory. Samantha wasn't going to let it rewrite hers. Samantha did not go back to the church. That surprised her. For most of her life, when something went wrong, she moved toward it. A problem with her mother's insurance? Call somebody. A family disagreement? Sit everyone down. A bill that didn't look right? Find the paperwork. A friend in trouble? Show up. But as she drove home that Saturday afternoon, she realized there was nothing she could fix by walking back through those church doors. She had already seen enough. When she reached her house, she carried the small gift bag inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. Then she stood there, still wearing the clothes she had traveled in, still holding her keys. She looked around the room she had left only days earlier. Everything was exactly where she had left it. A mug beside the sink, mail on the counter, a sweater hanging over the back of a chair. Her life had apparently continued while she had been gone. That almost made the church feel unreal. Then she opened her phone. There were no missed calls from Albert, No message asking where she was. Nothing. Samantha sat down. She called Denise. Her mother answered almost immediately. "Did you get there?" Samantha opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Denise's voice changed. "Samantha, I got home. Are you okay?" Samantha looked at the floor. "No." There was a long silence. "What happened?" Samantha swallowed. "I saw Albert." Another pause. "With Camille." Denise understood before Samantha finished. "Oh, baby." "He was getting married." Denise didn't say anything. Samantha pressed her hand against her forehead. "I came home early." "I know. The wedding program said tomorrow." Denise was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to figure everything out tonight." Samantha almost laughed. "I don't know how not to." "I know." That was all Denise said, and somehow hearing those words made Samantha cry harder. After the call ended, she sat alone for nearly an hour. The anger came next. She was angry at Albert, then at Camille, then at herself. She replayed conversations she had forgotten, every canceled dinner, every time Albert had said he was fine, every time Camille had told her not to worry. She began wondering how long they had known. How long had Albert been lying? How long had Camille been lying? What else had they lied about? Then Samantha remembered the property. She opened her laptop. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. She just knew she needed something concrete, something that didn't depend on memory. She opened the folder where she kept documents related to her grandmother's house, property records, insurance information, repair estimates, tax documents. Then she opened her email. She searched Albert's name. At first nothing seemed unusual. Old conversations, travel plans, bills, house listings. Then she found an email from several months earlier. Albert had forwarded information about renovation costs. Samantha stared at the date. It was from a period when she and Albert were still openly discussing their future. She opened another, then another. There were inquiries, questions about renovation, questions about potential rental income. One message referred to estimates Albert had requested. Samantha leaned back. He had been researching the property while they were still together. That wasn't automatically wrong. They had discussed renovating it. But then she noticed something else. Some of the research had been done after conversations in which Albert had already begun telling Camille that Samantha had emotionally left him. The dates mattered. Samantha started writing them down. Not because she wanted revenge, because she needed to know what had actually happened. She checked old messages. There were conversations with Albert where she had talked about coming home. There were messages where she had apologized for being away. There was one where she had said, "I really want us to work through this." Albert had replied, "We'll figure it out." Samantha stared at those 4 words. "We'll figure it out." He had known. He had known she believed they were still together. And while she was trying to repair the relationship, he was building another one. She closed her eyes. That was the part she couldn't explain away. Maybe she had failed him. Maybe she had been selfish without realizing it. Maybe she had expected too much patience, but he had known she was still trying. He had accepted her calls. He had listened to her talk about their future. He had allowed her to believe there was still something to save, and during that same period, he had been planning his future with Camille. Samantha looked again at the property documents, then at the gift bag sitting on the counter. She thought about how easily Albert had begun treating something that belonged to her as part of a future he was building without her. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about entitlement. He had taken Samantha's trust and quietly converted it into permission. She closed the laptop. For the first time that day, Samantha felt something other than grief. She felt clarity. She didn't know yet what she would do, but she knew what she wouldn't do. She wouldn't chase Albert. She wouldn't beg Camille for an explanation, and she wouldn't allow guilt over her own mistakes to become an excuse for theirs. Samantha picked up the gift bag. She opened it. The watch was still inside. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she put it back. Some gifts were meant for futures that never happened. And Samantha was beginning to understand that she had spent too long trying to save a future that had already been replaced. By Monday morning, Samantha had stopped asking herself whether she was overreacting. She had spent most of Sunday going through documents, not obsessively, carefully. She made a folder on her computer and began saving anything connected to the property that she could find. Renovation estimates, Emails, old messages, insurance documents, property records, anything that showed when Albert had contacted people or discussed possibilities involving the house. She wasn't trying to build a case against him. She didn't even know yet whether there was a case to build. She simply didn't trust her memory anymore, and she had learned that trust was exactly what had gotten her into this position. On Monday afternoon, Samantha met with an attorney who handled real estate matters. She brought a folder. The attorney looked through it slowly. "Do you own the property?" "Yes." "Any joint ownership?" "No." "Did you authorize Albert to enter into an agreement on your behalf?" "No." "Did he sign anything?" "Not that I know of." The attorney nodded. "Then the first thing we need to establish is exactly what he did." Samantha waited. "What do you mean?" "Researching a property isn't the same as having a legal interest in it. Getting an estimate isn't the same as entering into a contract. We need facts, not assumptions." Samantha appreciated that. She had expected someone to tell her how terrible Albert was. Instead, she was being told to slow down, so she did. They reviewed the documents together. Some of Albert's actions were completely harmless. He had researched renovation costs, he had looked at comparable properties, he had asked questions. But there were also things Samantha had never known about. Requests for estimates, financial projections, conversations about what the property could potentially generate. Nothing amounted to the dramatic theft she might have imagined in the first hours after discovering the wedding. But the pattern bothered her. Albert had been planning around something he didn't own. When Samantha finally confronted him, she didn't yell. They met at a coffee shop several days later. Albert looked exhausted. He didn't apologize when he first sat down. Instead, he said, "I don't understand why you're making everything complicated." Samantha stared at him. "The property is mine." "I know." "Then what's complicated?" "I was trying to figure out what we could do with it." Albert looked away. "I meant what Camille and I could do." The honesty was almost worse. Samantha took a breath. "You were doing that while we were still together." Albert frowned. "We were basically over." "I didn't know that." "You knew things weren't working. That isn't the same thing." He leaned back. "You weren't there, Samantha." She felt the old guilt rise immediately. For a second, she almost accepted it. Then she remembered the church, the wedding program, the lies. She looked at him. "I wasn't there enough," she said quietly. "I can admit that." Albert's expression changed. "But you still had a choice." "What choice?" "You could have told me it was over." He said nothing. "You'd have left me before you started planning your life with Camille." Continued. "You could have told me before I came home believing we were still together." His jaw tightened. "I didn't know how." "That may be true." She paused. "But not knowing how doesn't make lying honest." Albert became defensive. "I never tried to take your property." "I didn't say you did." "Then why are you involving lawyers?" "Because I don't know what you did." That silenced him. Samantha looked at him for several seconds. For years, she had been the person who absorbed discomfort so everyone else could feel okay. Not anymore. "I am not going to make myself smaller because you're uncomfortable with the consequences of your choices." Albert looked at her. Samantha picked up her folder. "I hope you have a good life, Albert." She stood, and for once walking away didn't feel like giving up. It felt like refusing to carry something that was never hers to carry. Albert and Camille did get married. There was no dramatic cancellation after Samantha walked out of the church, no last-minute confession, no moment when Albert suddenly realized he had made the worst mistake of his life and came running after Samantha. The ceremony continued. They said their vows, people applauded, photographs were taken, and for a while Albert and Camille were genuinely happy. That was something Samantha eventually had to accept. She had once believed that if two people betrayed someone to be together, their relationship would naturally collapse under the weight of what they had done. Real life wasn't that neat. Albert loved Camille. Camille loved Albert. They cooked together. They laughed. They decorated their home. They took weekend trips. There were mornings when Camille woke up beside him and felt certain that everything had happened for a reason. For a while she didn't think about Samantha. Or she tried not to. Then the little things began. One evening Albert came home late. "Where were you?" He took off his jacket. "Work." Camille watched him. "What took so long?" Nothing. We had a meeting. She nodded. Okay. But she noticed that he had turned his phone face down on the kitchen counter. She stared at it. Who's texting you? Albert looked at the phone. Nobody. The answer came too quickly. Camille felt something shift inside her. She didn't accuse him. Not then. She simply continued making dinner. But the question stayed with her. Why did I notice that? The answer frightened her, because she knew exactly what secrecy looked like. She had participated in it. She knew what it meant when two people suddenly became protective of their phones. She knew what it meant when explanations became vague. And she knew that Albert had once been capable of telling Samantha one story while living another. Now she was married to him. The suspicion became worse after Albert changed the password on a financial account. Camille noticed because she had previously known the password. Why did you change it? Albert looked up from his laptop. Security. Security from me? He frowned. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I just changed it. Camille nodded. Okay. But she didn't feel okay. Albert became frustrated. You're making something out of nothing. The sentence immediately stopped the conversation. Camille looked at him. For a moment she remembered Samantha. She remembered all the times Albert had told her that Samantha made him feel like his feelings were inconvenient. Now Camille was hearing something similar. You're making something out of nothing. She wondered whether this was what Samantha had felt. That thought made her uncomfortable. The suspicion worked both ways. Albert began noticing Camille's behavior too. If she came home late, he asked why. If she didn't answer a call, he wanted to know where she was. If she mentioned someone from work, he asked questions he hadn't previously cared about. Neither of them liked what was happening. One night, after an argument that had started over something as insignificant as a missed phone call, Camille finally said what had been sitting inside her for months. How do I know you aren't telling me the same story you told her? Albert stopped. What? Samantha. His face tightened. What does that have to do with this? Everything. No, it doesn't. You told me she had already abandoned you. She had. You told me the relationship was over. It was. She didn't know that. Albert looked away. Camille's voice became quieter. How do I know you're not doing that with me? He stared at her. She waited. For once, Albert had no explanation ready. He could have told her that. She was different. He could have promised that he would never lie to her. But the problem was obvious. He had once made Samantha promises too. And Camille knew it. I don't know, Albert finally said. The honesty surprised her. What? I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me why I should trust you. Albert sat down. I don't know. Camille looked at him. Neither spoke for a long time. The irony was painful. They had once believed that the problem with Albert and Samantha was that Samantha had stopped making him feel secure. Now Albert and Camille were living inside the consequence of their own choices. They had not destroyed trust. They had simply carried its absence into a new relationship. And Samantha, meanwhile, was beginning to understand something completely different. She didn't need to know whether their marriage survived. She didn't need Albert to regret choosing Camille. She didn't need their relationship to fail in order for her pain to have been real. That realization gave her a freedom she hadn't expected. She stopped checking, stopped asking mutual acquaintances, stopped wondering whether Albert was happy, because whether he was happy or miserable no longer determined what Samantha's life meant. She had spent enough years believing someone else's choices were evidence of her own worth. She was finally learning they weren't, and that lesson would become even more important when she eventually came face to face with Camille again. Years passed before Samantha saw Camille again. It wasn't planned. There was no message asking to meet, no invitation to talk things over, no carefully arranged apology. They simply ended up in the same place one afternoon. Samantha had been leaving a small community event when she noticed Camille standing near the entrance. For a second, neither woman moved. Camille looked older. Not dramatically, just different in the way people look different after life has happened to them. Samantha felt the old instinct immediately. Leave, avoid the conversation, protect the peace she had worked so hard to build. But Camille stepped forward. Samantha stopped. The word sounded strange between them. Camille looked down. I didn't know you would be here. Neither did I. A silence followed. Then Camille said, Can I talk to you? Samantha considered it. She didn't owe her anything, but she also realized she wasn't afraid of the conversation anymore. Okay. They sat outside. For a few moments, Camille talked about ordinary things, work, family, life. None of it mattered. Eventually she said, "I've wanted to apologize for a long time." Samantha looked at her. "I know." Camille's eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Samantha remained quiet. "I lied to you," Camille continued. "I told myself I was helping Albert. I told myself you had already left him emotionally." Samantha looked away. "You weren't wrong about everything." Camille swallowed. "I know. Wasn't a good partner during that time." "I know. But I wasn't gone." Camille nodded. "I know that now." That was the sentence Samantha had never expected to hear. Camille looked down at her hands. "I spent years comparing myself to you." Samantha's expression changed. Camille continued, "I didn't want to admit it. I thought I was your friend. I loved you. I still loved you while I was doing what I did." She shook her head. "That sounds terrible." "It does. I wanted what you had." Samantha didn't respond. "Not just Albert," Camille said, "everything." She took a breath. "You seemed secure. You had your family, you had the property, you had someone who wanted to marry you, and I kept looking at your life and thinking you didn't appreciate it." Samantha felt something painful settle in her chest. Camille wiped her eyes. "So when Albert started telling me how unhappy he was, I believed him because I wanted to believe him." "You wanted to believe I had already lost him." "Yes, because then you weren't taking him from me." Camille nodded. Didn't erase anything, but it gave the betrayal a shape. Camille hadn't simply fallen helplessly in love. She had made choices. She had compared herself to her friend. She had listened to Albert's pain. She had accepted a version of events that allowed her to feel innocent. And then she had continued even after she knew the truth was more complicated. Samantha finally said, "I understand why you did it." Camille looked up hopefully. Samantha continued, "But understanding isn't the same as pretending it didn't happen." The hope disappeared from Camille's face. "I know. I don't hate you," Camille began crying, "but I don't want you back in my life." She nodded slowly. "I understand." Samantha took a breath. "For a long time I thought forgiveness meant letting people back in." Camille listened. "I don't believe that anymore." Samantha looked toward the street. "Sometimes forgiveness is just deciding you don't want to spend the rest of your life carrying anger." Camille nodded. "I hope you're happy." "I am." The answer surprised even Samantha. She was. Not because everything had worked out perfectly. It hadn't. She still had difficult days. She still remembered the church. Sometimes she still wondered what might have happened if she had paid more attention to Albert earlier. But she no longer needed the answer. She had rebuilt her relationship with Denise differently. She accepted help. She stopped assuming that being a good daughter meant being available every second. She learned to say, "I can't do that today." She learned to ask, "What do you need from me?" And she learned to ask the same question in her romantic relationships. Not months later. Not after resentment had accumulated. Early, honestly. She also stopped measuring her worth by usefulness. That had been the deeper wound. For years, Samantha had believed love was something she earned by showing up, by fixing things, by remembering birthdays, by making sacrifices, by being the person everyone could depend on. She had never understood that love should also leave room for her to be human. The wedding had destroyed the future she thought she wanted. But years later, Samantha understood that losing Albert had not been the greatest tragedy. The greater tragedy would have been spending the rest of her life believing she had to exhaust herself to deserve being chosen. She had been an imperfect partner. She could own that. She had been distracted. She had made mistakes. She could learn from those things. But she no longer confused accountability with self-punishment. And she no longer confused forgiveness with permission to be hurt again. Samantha stood. Camille remained seated. For a moment they looked at one another. Then Samantha said, "I hope life is kind to you." Camille nodded. "And I hope it's kind to you too." Samantha walked away. She didn't feel victorious. She felt lighter. And perhaps that was the closest thing to victory she needed, because the woman who had walked into that Cleveland church years earlier had believed she was witnessing the end of her life. She hadn't known it then, but she was witnessing the end of something else, the belief that love required her to disappear inside someone else's needs. She never got the future she had planned with Albert, but eventually she stopped wishing for it. She had found something more important, a life in which she could love people without abandoning herself, and that, Samantha finally understood, was a future worth coming home to. For a long time, Samantha thought the worst thing that had happened to her was losing Albert. She eventually realized it wasn't. The worst thing would have been believing that his betrayal proved she wasn't enough, because Samantha had made mistakes. She had been distracted. She had neglected a relationship while trying to take care of her mother. She had assumed Albert would always understand. Those were things she could take responsibility for. But responsibility did not mean accepting blame for someone else's dishonesty. And maybe that's something many of us need to remember. You can admit where you were wrong without accepting blame for what someone else chose to do. You can apologize without begging someone to stay. You can forgive someone without giving them access to you again. And sometimes, the person you lose isn't the person who was meant to stay. Samantha spent years believing that being dependable was the same as being loved. But love isn't supposed to require you to disappear. You shouldn't have to exhaust yourself proving that you're worthy of being chosen. The people who truly love you should be able to tell you when they're hurting. They should be able to have difficult conversations with you, and when something is no longer working, they should have enough respect for you to tell you the truth. Because difficult honesty may break your heart, but deception can make you question your entire reality. Samantha couldn't change what happened in that church. She couldn't erase the wedding. She couldn't undo the years she had spent trusting the wrong people. But she could decide what happened next, and that's what she did. She chose herself, not selfishly, not bitterly. She simply stopped abandoning herself to keep everyone else comfortable. And perhaps that's the lesson worth carrying from her story. Sometimes losing the future you planned is what finally gives you the courage to build a future you actually need. If Samantha's story made you think about someone in your own life, or perhaps a decision you once had to make, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to learn the difference between forgiveness and allowing someone back into your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Daily Comfort Stories, and share it with someone who might need to hear this message today. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Samantha's story. Until our next story, remember, you can forgive someone and still choose yourself.